Now, the Germans settled in South Africa from about 1859, mostly from missionaries. And it grew. The missionaries, they brought out their families and so on, and eventually they established Kroondal, which we'll hear about just now. And all this can be attributed to the vision of one man, Louis Harms. Louis Harms was the founder of the Lutheran seminary in Hermannsburg in Germany. He was a very stubborn man, he was a dynamic preacher, and he built up a kind of a cult following amongst the people in the vicinity of Hermannsburg. And his main goal in the world, and his only goal in the world, was to preach the gospel to the heathens of the world. That was his mission. Harms had a vision of commencing his conversion of the heathens to Christianity with the Omoro. It was a tribe in East Africa, which is now in Ethiopia. But at the time, there was no shipping to that part of the world. And he decided to build a ship. Now, his followers and all one said, he's crazy, how can a missionary build a ship? But they didn't know Harms. And he built the ship. He had a ship built, the Kandatse. And the Kandatse was launched a month before the first missionaries left. It was launched on the 27th of September 1853 and left for East Africa the following month with 8 missionaries and 8 support staff. They normally sent support staff, mostly handymen, builders, carpenters, to help establish the missions stations. But when they got to East Africa, the local chief refused them to land. He didn't want the Christians there, so they had to go back. And somehow they got lost, and Helms's colleagues got worried, what happened to the ship. And they asked him, what would he do when the ship was lost? He said, well, we'll build another one. That was Harms's reply. And the crew decided to go back to Durban because they stopped on Durban to pick up supplies on their way up. And to their surprise, there was a German community in Durban at the time. Jonas Bergman, a German entrepreneur, had attempted to grow cotton north of Durban. And he brought out a large number of families from Hanover to work on his project. But unfortunately, nothing became of it. It went bang, and the Germans who he brought out were left to their own devices to make a living. Most of them became subsistence farmers. And the Kandatse arrived back in Natal on the 2nd of August 1854, after a voyage of more than 9 months from when they left in Germany. And they decided then to give up their dream of converting the Omororo, and decided, well, they'll, as a second choice, they'll establish their missions in South Africa. With the assistance of Reverend Posselt, he was from the Berlin mission, and he'd been living there in a number of years, and he became the pastor of the stranded Germans. I'll speak about him a bit later. And with his help, they purchased a farm of 6,000 hectares, about 160 kilometers north of Durban, and named their settlement Neu-Hermannsburg, which now is just Hermannsburg. And it was the first of many mission stations that was established in the coming years. In the northwest Transvaal alone, this area, there were 24 mission stations at the end of the 19th century. Now, Waldo Penzhorn, my great-grandfather, and the founder of Phokeng, grew up near Hermannsburg. And he, like many of the others, soon fell under the spell of Louis Harms. And him and his mother used to walk miles every Sunday to attend his services. And then he decided he was going to become his missionary. That was the only thing he ever wanted to do. He left school early, worked on a farm for a number of years, and then he asked Harms to be admitted to the seminary. But Harms said he was too young, he must go and learn a trade and apply later. So he became a carpenter, and later it came in good stead because it helped him to build his house and church and so on when he came here. Then, at the age of 21, Christoph was accepted at the seminary. He graduated, that was in 1857. He graduated in 1861. And he was in the third group of missionaries that were sent to South Africa. And he arrived in Durban in early 1862. The ship left Germany 1 month after they graduated. The Phokeng also wrote to Hermannsburg in Natal, requesting the Reverend Penzhorn to establish a mission in the area. Now, the only way I can explain why they asked for my great-grandfather was that Reverend Behrens, also a HMS Hermannsburg missionary, spent some 8 months in Phokeng in 1885. And probably he recommended my great-grandfather to both of the parties. Well, Christoph and his family left Natal in April 1866, and after a journey of 35 days by ox wagon, they arrived in Phokeng on the 25th of May. They were heartily received by Captain Mokgatle, and they were given a cow as a welcoming present. And later on the same day, they called on Paul Kruger to report to him and be given formal permission to establish the mission on Kruger's farm, which my great-grandfather called Saron. We're not sure why, but it was some biblical connection. In the early years, when Christoph began ministering, the Sunday services were held in a shed. And later, with Kruger's permission, he built a church on the farm. And the Sunday services were held in the church, and evening services and other things, church meetings, were held in his house. But it became too small. And without informing Paul Kruger, he started building a bigger house. Now, Kruger heard about this building activity and paid him a visit. And he said to Christoph, a Free State farmer had offered him £600 for the farm, and he was going to sell it to the farm. Now, Christoph was terribly upset and shocked by this, because he had just started his mission on the farm. And he discussed this with Mokgatle, and obviously Mokgatle also knew that the only hope for the mission, and for his tribe actually, is if the mission stayed at Phokeng. And the Phokeng raised most of the money, and the mission contributed a bit of it, and they agreed that they would buy the farm for £600. But when they sat down to sign the agreement, Paul Kruger said to him, "No, this farmer was now paid to pay £900 for the farm." Yes. And Christoph was furious, but he knew he had to raise the money because the future of the mission depended on it. So the Phokeng contributed £681. The mission donated an ox wagon to the value of £150, and Christoph borrowed £75 to make up the rest. And Christoph became an unwilling landowner. But little did he know that he would become a land baron later on. As a missionary, Christoph was doing much better than in Natal. Sekele Mokgatle, the son of the chief, was one of his first pupils and converts. And Sekele had previously worked on a farm, and in lieu of payment, the farmer had taught him to read and write, something very unusual for the time. And Sekele became the unofficial tutor in the evenings. He told them the language and the customs, and Christoph told him about the Bible and so on. And later on, he adopted the biblical name of Johannes, and Sekele was one of the first of the Phokeng to be baptized. Over the next few years, many members of the family of Mokgatle attended Christoph's services, and he baptized quite a few of them. Many of the vice captains also attended the services, but for many years they clung to their heathen beliefs, such as circumcision and polygamy, which were absolutely against the Lutheran churches. Therefore, even if they accepted the faith, they could not be baptized. Mokgatle also attended the Sunday services, but he also refused to be baptized, and as can be expected, most of his followers agreed with him. Mokgatle appreciated the fact that Christoph did not attempt to impose his views on him, and frequently asked the missionary for his opinion on various matters. The cordial relationship between the two also prevented tension developing between the converted and the non-converted of the tribe. And as a founder of the modern Phokeng, Chief Mokgatle from the beginning realized that his country and his tribe could only survive if they owned land. And in his reign for about 57 years, his main mission was to provide land for his people. But obviously they couldn't own land, so he had to devise a plan to overcome this obstacle. And he knew he couldn't do it by himself, and the only one he knew who could help him was Christoph, who agreed. And a unique partnership based on trust alone was formed between the black heathen and the white Christian. To raise enough money to buy land, Mokgatle ordered large numbers of his subjects to work on white farms, and others were sent to the mines in Kimberley. At the big hole in Kimberley is a plaque commemorating the Phokeng who had died while they worked on the diamond fields. Every one of them was expected to contribute £5, a huge amount in those days, to what they call the land fund. The plan was for the missionaries to buy the land and keep it in trust for the Phokeng until it was possible to transfer the property to black people. It was a risky venture, as there was no legal obligation on the part of the missionaries to honor the deal. But Mokgatle, it was the only option. And then the first farms were bought in the 1860. And in the following years, a total of 16 farms, ranging in size from 300 to 4,500 hectares were bought. In total, they bought 39,149 hectares. If you think Pilanesberg is 50,000 hectares, so this is nearly the size of Pilanesberg that they bought. The majority of these are registered in Christoph's name, and the others in the Reverend Venol's name. He was a missionary at Kana, not far from here. Years later, the properties were transferred to the Phokeng, the last one in 1912. Christoph probably raised money to buy these farms in Germany, but I couldn't establish it, but it's very unlikely that the Phokeng could have raised the money to buy all these farms by themselves. And by the early 1800s, there were nearly 20 missions in the northern Transvaal, and bearing in mind Harms's instruction to maintain the German language and culture, the missionaries started a private school at Morganson. It's not far from here. They bought the farm and they started the school there. But very soon they ran into financial problems because there weren't enough pupils. So they opened the school for other language groups, obviously whites. And interesting, one of the pupils was Jaapie de Tooy, who was later famous as Tertius, the writer and the translator of the Bible. He was there in 1887, and he was 11 years old, and his subjects were church history, world history, German, Dutch, English, and Latin. Another interesting thing is his father was at the time director of education in the Transvaal, but he sent his son to the school there at Morganson. The school was destroyed during the Boer War, and the schooling of the Germans then transferred to Kroonlaw. And then one of the highlights of Christoph's career as a missionary occurred in 1888, 26 years after his arrival in South Africa. Mokgatle, who was seriously ill, sent for Christoph to speak to him one last time. Christoph again asked the chief to agree to be baptized. And Mokgatle was over 80 at the time, and he consented. Christoph and the Christian members were delighted, and the baptism took place in the church, which Mokgatle helped to build. But to comply, the king had to get rid of all his wives except the first one, and he had about 40 of them. So, so he had one wife when he was baptized. And my great-grandfather wrote, "This wise and noble king, as Christoph described him, died on the 19th of September 1891 and was buried by his Muruti, his minister, Christoph, in the cemetery at the church in Saron, which we'll see later. Christo passed away on the 30th of November, 1895, at the age of 60. Johanna passed away 25 years later in Kronau, and both of them were buried next to where Mogatli was buried in Phokeng. When his father died, Ernst, the son, took over, and for 70 years, Penzhorn was the missionary in Phokeng. After Ernst, another 7 Germans, Hermannsburg is opposed to Phokeng. The last one was Heinrich Baumann, who left in 1996. And in 2013, the seminary in Hermannsburg closed its doors finally, 160 years after the first missionary had graduated in 1853. And that's it.